Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 16 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I would love to connect with you on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can check out the links below. Now let's get to the story. Early morning mist had settled over the harbor. The city was just waking up in the pre-dawn light, yawning before a reluctant rising. A few ships, from massive brigantines to fishermen's sloops, were slowly leaving and entering the bay, their crews probably only partly awake. Janir had not slept well, but that was no change since becoming Lucan's prisoner. Well before dawn, Lucan had awakened them, paid the innkeeper to house the horses until their return, and then dragged his captives out into the sleeping city. Janir was beginning to wonder where the Argatolums carried all this money. Seovan was awake and appeared to be fine, yet asking him how he was proved futile. Lucan was stricter than ever when it came to talking. He'd become lenient over the past few days, but since last night he was treating Janir as if Comic's attack had been her fault. The Argatolums followed Lucan without a word as he marched into the shipyards. They had been unusually quiet since Lucan's nonchalant treatment of Kamek's death. They moved a little more carefully around him now, like they weren't quite sure if he should be feared or not. Fishermen were on the beach, spreading their nets in preparation for the day's work, while the rhythmic clanging of a blacksmith's hammer told through the salty air. Squawking gulls soared overhead, eager to steal what they could when the fishermen brought their wriggling catches back. The skiff was waiting for them at the docks. The captain welcomed them onto the deck and showed Lucan a place by the prow of the vessel where he could deposit his prisoners. No questions asked. The Argatolum girl, elf and enchanter, were dumped just behind the prow on the hard oaken planks. With cool efficiency, the Argatolum warriors secured Janir and Kariel's chains to rings, conveniently located in the front of the ship. Janir wondered if this crew was in the habit of flaunting Brevia's slave boycott. Burly and filthy sailors hefted the oars up and down, throttling the small skiff onward. Lucan and the others marched about the deck, making sure their gear was properly stored. Seovan cast her a meager smile before Lucan noticed. The elf was trying to reassure her, and somehow that made it worse. Their small craft stopped at the mouth of the harbor to load the supplies for a brief but non-stop voyage. The skiff pulled close to the docks, and a series of barrels were dragged out of the warehouses to below deck by the hefty sailors. The harbor warehouses were an almost ramshackle collection of wooden buildings, weathered by years of facing the harsh sea air and salt water. They were built up on stilts to hold them out of the tide, resting against the jagged cliffs of the harbor mouth with ramps that went down to the ships. Merchants and sailors moved about the warehouses, each one to his duty without any concern for his surroundings. Kariel, Seovan, and Janir slumped behind the prow, watching the proceedings, helpless to do anything but wait. At this early morning hour, there were hardly any other vessels coming for supplies, so things appeared to be running quickly. "Where are we going?" Seovan whispered. He kept his eyes straight ahead, pretending to ignore the other two captives. "The Revelis Peninsula," Janir softly answered. "For the crystal something." "Crystal chamber," Kariel hastily corrected. "The holding cell of the greatest source of power in—" Janir landed a hard elbow to his ribs. "Quietly!" "Oh," Kariel cleared his throat. "Right. Let me explain. No, let me summarize. The Argatolums have the Key of Amatahns, and they want to use it to get to the crystal chamber. We don't know exactly what they plan after that. They've dragged us along because I know some things that might be helpful, and apparently Janir is that lovely gentleman's sister." The enchanter then did the great service of pointing out Lucan. Janir couldn't look at Seovan then. She wasn't sure which she feared more, him already knowing the truth or him learning it now. "Your Argatolum brother." Surprise rippled down her spine. "You knew?" Seovan offered a discreet shrug that reminded her of Kariel. As of a week or so ago. My father and Armandius explained it. Forgive me, Janir said reflexively. Forgive what? Just, there were a great many things. She was sorry for having been born with the blood of the Lord Argatalam in her veins. She was sorry for being the reason they were all here. She was sorry for not thinking of a way to free them. All of it. There's nothing to forgive. Seven said it without inflection, as if it should be a readily accepted fact. You hate Argatalams, Janir whispered, almost afraid to say it. I do not hate you, Seven softly answered. I could never hate you, even if I so wished it. Janir experienced that familiar fluttering in her belly. He didn't hate her, and he couldn't. Warmth spread through her chest, and just for a moment, she didn't see the morning as so terrible. I realize that in the past I have said, Seven cleared his throat, things that were hateful, things that must have upset you greatly. For that, I am sorry. With a deep breath, Janir tried to think of what to say. That means a great deal. Seven risked looking at her sideways to cast her a brief smile of gratitude. Kariel's face screwed up in a disgusted pose and mimed vomiting. Janir and Seven elected to ignore him, though Seven seemed more irritated by it. Lucan and the Argatalams brooded as they waited for the supplies to be loaded. The warriors stood a little apart from their leader. Janir could only imagine what sort of things they must be saying about Lucan now. None of them were watching the captives at the moment, leaving the trio free to speak to one another. Seven took advantage of it. Janir, listen. Duke Ronan was given a substantial sum from Slavin to kill Armandius. We believe their aristocracy might be planning another invasion. 17 years ago, Brevia had been invaded by the Slavish armies. The invasion had been largely successful in the beginning, reaching all the way into the heart of Brevia to seize the capital of Saradin, but their forces were spread too thin at that point. The High Lords had rallied their men together and attacked them at their weakest, cutting off the army from their supply routes and destroying them. The ultimate result was that the then Sultanate was replaced by a ruler from the House of Vanmar, made strong through unparalleled politicking and an alliance with the Argatalams. Janir herself wouldn't have existed without that war. Ariana Kayerson had been carried off in the fall of Saradin. If Janir's memory served her correctly, her mother had been a gift to the Lord Argatalam from one of the Slavish generals in an effort to smooth over some dispute. Whatever these Argatalams want with the key, it cannot be a coincidence, Seven surmised. They must be trying to collect it for their allies. They cannot use the magic themselves. Lucan came back along the deck, casually sauntering like a panther in the early morning sunlight. It occurred to Janir that many girls would probably think her brother handsome. He had the fit build and artful bone structure envied by many. We should be loaded soon. Lucan leaned against the railing, just out of reach in case one of them thought to try something. Then we'll be on our way. Thank you for the update, Kariel said with mock appreciation. I was not addressing you, Enchanter, Lucan snapped. He must have been in a forgiving mood as he didn't strike anyone. You may speak when spoken to. Is that not right? Janir realized he was singling her out. Whatever you say. Lucan straightened, surveying the early morning ocean. The sea is different this far north, he said contemplatively. More frigid, less alive. Janir didn't believe he was actually trying to elicit a conversation, so she decided to keep quiet. Her carcatan were still tucked in his belt, and while she couldn't be hurt with them, it had been proven that both Seven and Kariel could. I'll be glad when this is done and we can return to Adasha. Then you can disappoint all those unpleasable wretches. His lip curled as he brushed his hand over the railing, flicking away imaginary dust. I assume you have not forgotten home. Janir felt like he expected a response. You mean to take me back to Adasha? Of course. Why else would I be dragging you over creation? He sounded suddenly irritable. Once I have contained the power from the crystal chamber, we will be going back. Janir peered discreetly at Kariel and Seven, but Neither one of them seemed to have any clue what he was talking about. What? She cleared her throat hesitantly. Seovan shot her a cautioning look and shook his head almost imperceptibly. But if Lucan was in a chatty mood... Are you going to take the power for yourself? Janir's mind flashed with images of Florit's still body on the ground. The magic in that chamber is strong enough to kill an Argotolum. No, I am going to use either the elf or the enchanter, or both, to contain the magic. Kill an Argotolum, but... No, that makes no difference, Lucan impatiently corrected. This magic was taken from the Mazag, even you remember them, and distilled in pure form. It can affect us in its raw state. Once contained in another life form, however... Lucan stared out across the water pensively. He looked so harmless when he stood like that. No one would guess he had murdered a little girl just a few weeks ago. It will be tainted by their blood, and then it will be useless against our kind. Who is it for? Janir pressed, pushing her luck. Lucan glanced at her sideways with suspicion. I don't kiss and tell. The sailors finished loading the few barrels into the bottom of the ship. They separated the skiff from the ramp and pushed off into the open sea. Waves rocked the vessel, and the sail idly lolled in the breeze. There was the creaking of wood as the oars twisted in their sockets, rising above the sound of distant gulls. Lucan seemed to lose interest in his sister. He meandered to the other side of the ship to speak with his Argotolums. Carlisle leaned over, keeping his voice down as much as possible. Is it just me, or was nothing about that chat reassuring? We must escape, Seovan flatly stated. Whatever happens, we must not be prisoners when we reach the peninsula. Whatever happens, we must not be prisoners when we reach the peninsula. They sailed, if it could be called that, well into the day and the evening. Janir was beginning to wonder why the term sailing was associated with a smooth and uninterrupted ride. Sailing involved swells and waves and ornery winds. Carlisle had turned several shades of green and fed the fish his meager breakfast by midday, while Janir was no better. The only comfort she received was that several of the Argotolums were almost the same color, except Lucan. Lucan showed as much adaptability to the sea as any of the sailors. It wasn't long before both Janir and Seovan were sunburned. Carlisle resembled a pouting green and red lobster. Apparently, below deck was very cramped and crowded, and it was more convenient to leave the captives up top. Besides, it left them in full view of the entire crew, leaving little chance they would have the opportunity to try anything devious. Janir began considering herself and the others slaves, but Lucan had his warriors put forth a little more effort to look after them. Their fundamental needs were attended, even if it was not in the most gracious fashion. She nearly broke a tooth on the hard biscuits they were fed for supper. Toward the deep of the night, when a crescent moon hung like a sickle in the sky, when the Brevian coast was just a dark sliver on the horizon and all other ships were out of sight, Lucan watched from the back of the skiff. The sea had grown calmer, and the eerie dip of the oars in the water was one of the few sounds in the crisp sea air. What does he see? Carlisle whispered. How would I know? Was Janir's clipped response. Lucan waved over one of his Argotolums and exchanged several brief sentences. The warriors surveyed the sea in their wake, speaking in low tones. What is he saying? Carlisle wondered. How would I know? Janir snapped a second time. Quiet, Seovan scolded. I am trying to listen. Lucan pursed his lips, then spun around and made for the front of the ship. He went immediately to his prisoners and produced the keys from their place around his neck. Without a word, Lucan undid the chains binding them to the prow of the skiff. Come with me, he commanded. It occurred to Janir that there were 3 of them, and their bonds were being held by a single boy. The covert looks from Seovan and Carlisle said they had seen it the same way, but the other Argotolums were only a few paces off. The 3 of them let him lead past the heaving oarsmen to the back of the ship. Carlisle bumped into Janir, standing on his tiptoes for a better view. What is it? Lucan gave the enchanter a harsh glare and hissed for silence. He pointed to the shadowy horizon, in the direction of the mainland. What do you see there, elf? He demanded. Seovan stared across the water, peering into the dark. Janir strained to see what it was, but she could only make out several shapes in the moonlight that might have been swells. Briefly, she thought she saw one of them rise out of the water, but it might have been her imagination. "I see trouble," Seven said coldly. "A group of 4 mazag, swimming toward us." A moment of silence descended upon the deck. Lucan brandished a carcatan and held it in front of the elf's face. "If you are lying to me..." "It is no lie." Seven was calm and factual, though Janir felt a panic coming on. "How would you even know what one looks like?" Lucan snapped. "You can't be that old." "The memories of my people live on long after we die," Seven vaguely answered. "Wait a few hours and the truth of it will be proven. The creatures may not be gaining fast, but they will catch us eventually." For just a few moments, fear of the monsters outweighed her fear of her brother. "Give the key back, Lucan," Janir pleaded. "Not a chance," Lucan hissed back. Carlyle was shaking his head. "Oh dear," he mumbled. "This is not good. Not good at all." "Don't you see they're relentless?" Even as she said it, Janir knew she'd never talk reason into her brother. "They're going to kill us all if we don't give it back." She remembered the great mazag that had followed her and Carlyle out of the cavern. It had been willing to negotiate for peace. Perhaps these would as well. Despite the fate of the great mazag, she was not so certain their small group could stand against 4 beasts. 4 beasts that must have tracked them for weeks and were doubtless angered by the death of their companion. "It was stolen from them," Janir said. "They just want it back. Just give it back." "Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that you were the one to steal it, true?" Lucan countered. "Don't you see? You killed one of them." The small crew was comprised of about 10 oarsmen in all. Every one of them and the captain was staring at the brother and sister with bewilderment. One of the Argatolums, the one who seemed to have taken up Kamak's habit of questioning Lucan's authority, made to step forward. "My lord, we should let them come. We slew the last beast. There is nothing to say we cannot slay more." All around the ship, eyes and ears were fixed on their conversation. A sense of dread and doom befell the skiff in almost an instant. Settling in everyone familiar with the mazag, even those who thought they stood a chance fighting. Their fear infected the sailors like a disease, becoming an almost palpable thing in moments. Abruptly, the skiff's captain stepped forward. "Someone want to explain?" "You will do as I tell you," Lucan growled. "You will take this ship straight for the Revelis Peninsula, and that will be the end of it." "I don't know what's happening here, and we're not moving until I do." "Don't make me open your veins." Lucan's tone was low, threatening, and enough to frighten Janir. Yet the sailor was unimpressed. "You think I am afraid of you, boy?" The captain puffed himself up to his full height. "What are you going to do?" Lucan gave an angry cry and slashed the captain's throat with a concealed dagger and a swift motion. "I will not tolerate insubordination," Lucan screamed. "Row! Ahead!" Glancing down at the still gasping body of the captain, her brother added, as if an afterthought, "Toss this in the sea." For once, the Argatolums looked something other than unimpressed. Lucan cast them a glare to say he had no problem dealing with any of them the same way. This time, they moved to obey his order without question, and the sailors did the same. After all, if the boy was that bloodthirsty and cold, what must the men be like? Now even the Argatolums gave him a wide berth. That was the second time Janir had seen her brother kill. She looked determinedly away from the body, but she didn't stop trying to talk reason into him. "You fought one, and you didn't think we should try negotiating?" "Firstly, I seem to recall that creature lost the last round. Secondly, how far away did they look to you?" Lucan demanded. 2, 3 miles? 1, Seven blandly interjected. "It hardly matters. Onward!" Lucan snapped, seizing Janir's chains with fury and yanking her and the others after him. Jerking their shackles mercilessly at every opportunity, Lucan dragged them to the front. After roughly securing all 3 of them near the prow again, Lucan strode back to tend to the ordering of the sailors. The mazag were relentless in their pursuit, but Lucan was just as relentless in his flight. By dawn, there was no sign of the irregular shapes and sulking scales. Still, Janir had no doubt that they would be back, and soon. The clicks and clacks of the one who had spoken to her at the caverns echoed in her mind. That creature had been determined, willing to die even. She couldn't help but believe that these would be the same. But a new threat loomed on the horizon. Clouds the color of coal lined the sky in the direction they were headed. Nature itself might have been steering them from the Revelis Peninsula, but Lucan did not heed such warnings. The skiff jolted along the wind, a wind that seemed dangerously strong to Janir, but she had never been out to sea before. Perhaps it was normal? She caught the flicker of lightning bolts in the dark clouds. Those were not normal, even she knew that. In spite of foul weather, Lucan did not let the crew rest. 2 more sailors had rebelled against him since the captain, and they had both been swiftly done away with. The remainder had learned from the mistakes of their compatriots and deemed it best for their health not to question the temperamental Argotolum. Lucan stared at the stormy horizon with a set jaw and a stubborn outlook. He would keep going until he succeeded, or it killed him. Or killed all of them, for that matter. As they drew nearer to the storm, the sea became quieter and quieter. Janir twisted to see over the prow of the ship. The storm was coming at them, closer, ever closer, advancing like a host of furious warriors. Lucan didn't let them stop. He pushed them on despite protests from the sailors and a few from his men. By now, even the Argotolums seemed afraid of him. No one was quite sure what he would do anymore, and it appeared no one was quite brave enough to attempt mutiny. In the distance, there was a sharp wailing, the screaming of the wind. Thunder rumbled like the stomach of a hungry beast. Lightning split the sky. Pitch-black clouds masked the sun and swept in for the kill. The wall of rain, wind, and thunder hit them like a wave of bricks. The unnatural wind snapped the mast in two as if it were fashioned of twigs, and the rain pinned Janir to the deck. Lucan was bellowing commands. The waves splashed over the ship, the sailors were shouting, and 2 of them were swept overboard. Exactly what happened next, she couldn't tell for the heavy torrents of rain. She could hardly breathe without taking in water. Couldn't open her eyes without having them flooded with rain. "Hold on to each other!" Seovan yelled. Carael clung to her in the near darkness, and Seovan was somewhere to her left, with an arm behind her back, gripping Carael. A fresh wave swept over the deck, and Janir was suddenly grateful that she was chained down as the force threatened to drag her over the side. She thought her wrists would snap off, but the wave receded into the sea, and she found she was still in one piece. The 3 captives coughed and spat out seawater, fishy, salty, and slimy, all at the same time, and cold, icy cold. The ship heaved, rising upon a wave and then smashing downward with a terrific splash. As the ship went into the air, Janir lifted above the ship, connected to it only by the chains on her wrists. As it went down, she and the other 2 slammed into the hardened wood. Rain blinded her. She tried to bat the water away, but no sooner had she done that than more poured from the sky to replace it. "This rots!" Carael screamed, and she only heard that because her ear had ended up in front of his mouth. She jerked away from his shrieking and slammed into Seovan's lip with the back of her head. "Sorry." There was a muffled sound of acknowledgement from the elf, and then another wave hit. Again it tried to drag them into the sea, drown them in its frigid embrace. Carael was whining, but she didn't care. There was something wet and slimy on her neck, probably seaweed, but she couldn't help fear it was some poisonous ocean creature. She'd lost sight of Lucan and the others. They could be struggling to keep the skiff upright, swept overboard, or huddling below deck for all she knew. The skiff reared, jumbling her and the other 2 in a frantic pile before smashing into the water. Janir thought perhaps she had landed with her cheek on Seovan's chest, but they were launched upwards again a moment later. The cold water had numbed her sore wrists, but she hated not being able to feel Carael clenching her arm. She had to open her eyes in the downpour and look for him. He was still there, a blurry pile of robe and legs hunched beside her. Each of them kept clinging to the others, as if they could save themselves if they just stayed together. How long had this been going on? A few minutes? An hour? Days? She lost track of time as they fought to keep a grip on one another. That was her only focus, holding on to the elf and the enchanter. A creaking, scraping, tearing pierced above the roar of the storm. "That can't be good," Carael shouted. The skiff was flung like rubble out of a catapult, higher and higher. It was going to be very painful when they came down, Janir thought. Smash! It was very painful. The craft struck the water, and they were flung across the deck, their chains ripped free, and Janir was being thrown from the ship into the tossing waves. She struggled against the current and felt Seovan thrashing beside her. Blindly, Janir groped in the wet darkness for Carlisle, but she couldn't find him. Seovan and Janir managed to get their heads above water, but something pulled them back into the wave. In spite of her struggling, the salt water was over her head, choking her very existence. The thought crossed her mind of how devastated Armandius would be, how she hoped he would be all right, that he would... Why did Seovan have to come for her? Why did he have to be captured too? And Carlisle... The current pulled at the wrist Carlisle had been chained to. She struggled, trying to get him out of the current. What was that? Were her feet touching something? With a start, Janir realized her feet were hitting rocks. Was she dreaming? Was this some pre-mortem hallucination? The rain gradually began to thin, and between waves, Janir saw she was stumbling after a short figure in a wildly flapping robe. Carlisle had dragged them into the waves to get them to shore. As if an invisible hand had just shoved back a curtain, they were out of the brutal rain. One last wave rose out of the water and charged after the bedraggled castaways. It struck Janir's back, driving her onto a beach. She crashed into sand and felt the individual grains grinding into her cheek. The soft, comforting rain trickled from the sky. It felt like a dream. It couldn't be real. They had been dying. Seovan crashed onto the sand beside her, gasping for air. Thunder crackled in the distance, and then the world went black. This has been the Broken Enchantments podcast. Thank you for listening. Check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.